I'm Walter Shapiro, and I am thrilled to have this panel to discuss one of the most important states in terms of the election, which is Wisconsin, which is one of the states where the Democrats broke their heart in 2016. Let me introduce the panel. Emma Roller lives in Milwaukee, is coming to us direct from Milwaukee. In terms of the New Republic, she is the author of How Wisconsin Became a Bastion of White Supremacy in the current issue of the New Republic. She also writes frequently for many publications like In These Times, Jezebel, and where I've seen her byline often, the New York Times. Dan Kaufman, who comes to us not from Wisconsin, even though he's an expert on Wisconsin, is the author of the acclaimed 2018 book, The Fall of Wisconsin, The Conservative Conquest of a Progressive Bastion and the Future of American Politics. He has written for the New York Times and the New Yorker. And supposedly joining us fairly soon is the Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, Mandela Barnes, who is the youngest Lieutenant Governor in Wisconsin history, and also is the first African American to be elected Lieutenant Governor in Wisconsin history, and only the second African American to be elected statewide. He was part of the winning ticket in 2018 with Tony Evers that defeated the Dred Scott Walker. And anyway, Mandela hopefully will be joining us momentarily. One thing I will say to the panel before we start is, as all of us we're trying to cover a lot of ground, so keep your answers relatively crisp, because while I will not cut off your microphone, what I will do is say the most frightening words in the English language. Thank you, Vice President Pence. And that will be a warning. At 12:45 or thereabouts, we will take a few audience questions. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And again, thank everyone for being here. And let me start with a question for Emma, which is, since you're on the ground in Milwaukee, what are you seeing that we might not pick up in the polls, we might not pick up in terms of the news clips, that really just watching people being there tells you that we don't know?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. First of all, I'm excited to be coming to you from my dining room in Milwaukee. And in terms of what's different on the ground, I think that I'm seeing a lot more activated people than I did 4 years ago, in terms of sort of superficial signs like lawn signs, people, but also, poll workers. That's a phenomenon that was a real struggle in April in Wisconsin. And we are now, as far as I know, back up to a level where hopefully we will have enough poll workers. I was just at the DMV a couple of days ago, actually, to get my driver's license and register to vote. And it was very organized. It was the fastest DMV experience I ever had, which I was really not expecting, because you hear all these nightmare stories about the voter ID laws here. But I was thankfully able to get my driver's license and will be voting momentarily, I hope.
Dan, if you can just, as the expert on the political history of Wisconsin, without going into too much detail, could you just give us a brief summary of the electoral wars that took what struck me as a safe, progressive state, the home of La Follette, the home of Gaylord Nelson, a state that elected Tammy Baldwin as the first openly gay senator, the state of Russ Feingold, and made it battleground, ground zero for the political wars of the last decade?
Sure. Well, of course, it's never simple, but I think some of that might be overstated a bit. John Kerry and Michael Dukakis did win Wisconsin, but very narrowly. So there was a lot of erosion into that progressive strength even earlier. But
I think we may have a technological malfunction with Dan for a moment, which is the joys of living the
basically,
Zoom
in
life.
2010,
He
the
is back.
estimate trade movement in Wisconsin going after public sector employees with the notorious law that became called Act 10. And passed a right to work law. And basically, you've seen Wisconsin's union density go to almost half of what it was. It was about 15% in 2010 to about 8%, the same as Alabama, roughly. And that has really affected, in my view, the state's politics, both the decimation of the labor movement, which plays an outsized role in getting people to the polls, but also in kind of engendering what I would call divide and conquer politics. Walker stoked resentment against the public employees. He actually famously used those words, that he was going to use divide and conquer. And it's become a much more embittered place than it was prior to 2010. The Republicans have also been very successful at, were very successful at passing a very extreme gerrymandering that basically made the legislature impervious to electoral outcomes. There's been several instances where Democrats have won a wide majority of aggregate statewide votes, but wind up with virtually the same number of assembly people. So I think that's the short answer to what has happened to the state. But at the same time, it's still fiercely contested. Tony Evers won in 2018. There has been a fatigue with this kind of politics, and the progressive portions of the state never disappeared. They were frustrated, but I think some of that is, it came out in several recent elections, and conservatives have won only 1 of 9 statewide elections since Trump was elected. So
Now, both of you, how worried are you about Biden right now in Wisconsin? For example, before we went on, I guess the air, I checked with Nate Silver's website, which this year is being moderately conservative, that gives Biden an 84% chance of winning Wisconsin. And I looked at the polls that they consider high quality polls, and there's been no poll for the last 3 weeks that has Biden with a smaller margin than 5%. So what, for both of you, starting with Emma, because you're there, what do you worry about?
Sure. I also just checked the Real Clear Politics polling average before coming on here, and I believe it said Biden's up by an average of about 5 points in Wisconsin right now. That said, I'm wary of trusting, not to sound too much like the president, but I am warier today of trusting the polls than I was 4 years ago, because I got burned 4 years ago and never thought Wisconsin would have gone for Trump. But as Dan mentioned, there are all these intervening factors with voting rights, especially that affected that outcome. In terms of how worried I am, I would say that I'm, and I get at this in my piece for the New Republic, I'm more worried about what things will look like even if Trump loses the election in November, because as we've seen, while Trump may not be in the White House, there are many people who agree with him and his policies in state houses across the country, and that is especially true in Wisconsin.
Well, Dan, from the litigation side, we're right now dealing with, I think, the latest. It's really hard to keep the voting rights litigation straight in Wisconsin, but as near as I can tell, this Federal Court of Appeals, I believe the Court of Appeals on which Amy Coney Barrett sits, even though she's not taking any new cases, ruled about 2 days ago that extending the this problem with voting rights litigation, it's complicated, that number one, they reversed themselves and said, it is not enough to have an absentee ballot postmarked on election day. It has to be received on election day. And I think they cut back, going back to what you were talking about, Emma, they cut back on that poll workers now only have to work in the precinct in which they are registered to vote. They cannot be certified as a poll worker and work where needed. This kind of litigation, I think, is now going to be appealed to the full Court of Appeals for Wisconsin. But one of the justices, one of the three justices on the panel who dissented, wrote in her dissent, "God help the state of Wisconsin."
Well, I think it's just part and parcel of what you've seen for the last 10 years. The courts have been used to kind of entrench minority rule, both at the state level and at the federal level. You saw that in the April primary elections when Governor Evers tried to postpone it, and that was rejected. And the US Supreme Court also intervened to disallow the ballots from being counted later. But this is a deep trend in Wisconsin over the past 10 years, where the legislature will go to the state Supreme Court to basically act in their interests. And it's a very partisan court. It's heavily funded by dark money. And a lot of what happens in Wisconsin is just mirrored nationally on voting rights and all kinds of other issues. That said, I think there is a growing backlash in the state. And you saw that when Jill Karofsky in April, the state Supreme Court justice, a liberal, won a surprisingly strong victory, and including in places all across the state. I think there's some fatigue and there's a kind of pent up progressive anger. I was in the state for several weeks working on a story for the New Yorker about rural areas. And there was—
When were you there, Dan?
What's that?
When were you?
I was there in February, just before the pandemic.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of, and you do see a lot of, signs for Trump and Pence, but there was a surprising amount of Biden signs. And there was also a surprising number of people that told me they were frightened to put up signs for fear of their neighbors, but their loyalties were not with the president. So I think there is a significant drop-off of support for this kind of agenda that is so scorched earth. And again, this sense of a frustrated lowercase d democratic principles there, where you really have a really entrenched minority control. And that is why voting rights litigation and dark money, it's all part of a much wider array of policies that have kept out the majority of the citizens and made the state a conservative laboratory for very extreme policies.
I must mention that the original phrase "states are the laboratories of democracy," I believe was used to discuss Wisconsin during the progressive era. So it has gone in a century from the laboratory of what a progressive government can do in a state to a laboratory of what a vote suppression, all tactics are permissible, Republican majority can do in a state.
Mm-hmm. And just to piggyback off of what Dan was saying, it's absolutely true that Wisconsin is this, or was this, canary in the coal mine for what we're seeing at the national level right now. I would also say North Carolina sticks out in my mind in terms of what they've done to degrade voting rights and with gerrymandering and locking in that minority rule that Dan was talking about. We're now seeing, Senator Mike Lee, he had this tweet the other day talking about how, the focus shouldn't be on democracy. And so we're seeing all of these signals about that's trying to degrade very core democratic principles, and it's nothing new necessarily. However, in Wisconsin, this started 10 years ago. It didn't start with Donald Trump. And Dan, you also mentioned your piece for the New Yorker, which I wanted to bring up, which I think doesn't get covered a lot. I think for people outside of Wisconsin and people inside Wisconsin, the assumption is often, the cities or the urban centers are liberal and the rural areas are conservative, which is true to an extent, but in my own experience, the most conservative support for Trump is not in the rural farming areas in Wisconsin. It's in the direct suburban areas, and especially the 3 surrounding counties that surround Milwaukee County, known as the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and Washington County.
Thank you for doing that. I was afraid I was going to have to do it on my own. I was going to mangle one of them.
But Dan, I wanted to talk to you about when you were reporting your piece for the New Yorker. What did farmers tell you? What did rural Wisconsinites tell you?
Well, it ran the gamut, but I think there's a real frustration, like a lot of problems. And I think, you know, Trump was both a product of the immediate Tea Party wave in some ways, but also goes back much deeper. And big agriculture has wiped out rural America. It happened a bit later in Wisconsin because dairy, for complicated reasons I won't bore you with, tended to resist those things, particularly in Wisconsin, where you had what's called the driftless area, a huge swath of the western part of the state, whose topography made it more difficult to have corporate farms. So it preserved some of this rural cohesion. And in fact, you're absolutely right. The rural areas were some of the most progressive areas in America. The La Follettes drew on that strength. Scandinavian farmers, they set up agricultural cooperatives. They were more likely to join the trade union movement, Finnish miners and so on. So that coalition was always there, and particularly in the driftless area, it was very strong progressive politics. But it eroded, but also kept the state, you know, democratic for much longer than other places that might have switched. So I think, but I don't think there's a great love of Trump. I mean, the farmers have really suffered the trade wars, but it isn't really that. It's really consolidation of dairy and the squeeze to always get bigger and bigger. And basically they're seeing these giant factory farms kind of squeeze them out. And there's resentment there. And sometimes it got directed in 2016 against, it was a kind of anti-establishment anger, I think. But I don't think there's I think there has been significant drop off in the rural areas. And you saw that Tony Evers did significantly better than his opponents had. And that helped him win this narrow victory. And I think the other thing I just wanted to mention is I think the state Democratic Party as a tactical entity is in a much stronger position than it was 4 years ago. Ben Wickler, who's the head of it, is a very savvy organizer, and they have not, they're really, they seem much more cognizant of not ignoring these other areas and being much more connected to grassroots, whereas Clinton's campaign operation did not really fuse itself with the state operation. It was a top-down approach that, and again, it wasn't just that she didn't campaign there. She didn't even run an ad in the state until a week before the election. So that was quite damaging. So anyways, all of those factors, I think that there is less passion for Trump, particularly in the driftless area. In the North Woods is still very heavily pro-Trump, but the western part of the state, I think, is very mixed.
For those of us who are not masters on the geography of Wisconsin, could both of you give us sort of starting with Emma, a primer on the WOW counties?
Sure, so.
And how they differ amongst themselves also?
Okay, this is gonna be tricky even for me. So I'm gonna do the opposite of what Michiganders do with the mittens.
Oh, I went to school in Michigan, so.
So if you can imagine, Lake Michigan's over here, southeastern Wisconsin's over here, here's Milwaukee, and then the WOW counties sort of ring Milwaukee County. And so what you saw in the 50s and 60s in Wisconsin is the same trends you saw in many other cities across America during that time, which is white flight. So many white families left Milwaukee County and moved to these suburban and exurban areas. And as a result, Milwaukee County was sort of left by the wayside, underfunded, et cetera. And Scott Walker actually got his career started as Milwaukee County executive, which a lot of people don't know, as this sort of tough-talking conservative who branded himself as just a sensible conservative who eats his brown bag lunches. And he sort of used that racial resentment I would say, to launch his career. And you see the same patterns with talk radio, which I get at in my piece, which is a huge factor in forming political opinion in Wisconsin. Is there have been these two figures who have been on the air for basically my entire life. One is named Mark Belling, and he is very conservative. He's like Wisconsin's Rush Limbaugh, basically. And he has taken to Donald Trump like a fish to water, loves him. And lots of white, older Wisconsinites listen to his radio program every day and are just getting pumped that propaganda, for lack of a better term, straight to their ears every day. The other person who I get at in my piece is Charlie Sykes, who's a more interesting case. He also made his career off of that racial resentment, including up until a few years ago, he published a book called A Nation of Moochers, and even referred to Michelle Obama on his radio program as one of those moochers, which he later had to apologize for. And you've seen since then, he's quit radio and has rebranded himself as this never Trumper, who is a conscious conservative in the vein of how Paul Ryan has tried to brand himself. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just would piggyback on what Emma says. I think talk radio plays an outsized, even larger role in southeastern Wisconsin than in other similar places.
Is it demographically that the audience is older, or that there's more driving involved? As a New Yorker, I'm trying to figure out why it plays such a large role.
I think it's partly also that you have to look, this is also taking place in an area that is experiencing severe deindustrialization. Southeastern Wisconsin is sort of the Rust Belt part of the state, Racine, Kenosha, and these kinds of, these kinds of racial resentment really can be fueled in that context, and I think they seized on that. Going back to Reagan, and attacking welfare and these kind of coded languages around those things. And Milwaukee, going back to the 40s, there was it had a tradition of socialist mayors, and the last one was a guy named Frank Zeidler. And Zeidler, I wrote about this in a piece for the New York Times. He was very committed to equal opportunities, and he pointedly inaugurated a housing project in Milwaukee and gave one set of keys to a white family and one set of keys to a black family. And that engendered a massive backlash, including death threats against his family, and a vicious smear campaign that he was paying for billboards in the South to urge African Americans to come to Milwaukee. His family had to have armed guards 24 hours a day. I spoke to his daughter many times. She was a wonderful woman. She passed away a couple of years ago. But I think, and George Wallace got his start in Milwaukee in the '64 campaign. He said, if I could be buried anywhere else but Alabama, it would be the south side of Milwaukee. So there was always, I think there was a lot of, the real estate industry did a very good job at kind of fomenting these fears. These were working class communities that were basically most of their earnings were in their homes. And so there was a lot of blockbusting going on there. And that fueled it as well. It's always been very extreme, Wisconsin has in that way. And not limited to African Americans, by the way. In northern Wisconsin, I focus a lot on Native Americans in my book, and there was some vicious, in the 80s when I grew up in Madison, there were some vicious attacks on Native American tribes, including some kind of vigilante groups that would issue death threats at boat landings because the tribes had won their treaty rights. So there's a deep seatedness to all of this, but I think the talk radio's prominence is also, media consolidation has eliminated a lot of news sources in the state, and that's a big part of it too.
Let me, since you mentioned the racial aspect of Wisconsin politics, lots of people, lots of Democrats outside of the state, when the protests began in Kenosha, the general depressed Democratic responses, here it comes, this will just prove that Trump's law and order pitch works with racist white voters. This is how we lose Wisconsin. Oh my God, here we go again. And judging from the polls, this hasn't happened. Do either of you have theories as to why?
I wouldn't say I have a theory, but just what I've personally witnessed in the past couple of months with the horrific shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha. And unfortunately, southeastern Wisconsin has a long and storied history of police brutality against Black men and women in the state. I talk about the case of Frank Jude Jr., which happened in the early 2000s.
Which is horrifying the way you describe it in your piece. Which
was basically a mob of off-duty Milwaukee police officers just horrifically beat this man, Frank Jude Jr., who is biracial, and it became a big story. And one of the officers who was charged in that case 2 years earlier had shot and killed a Black man in the exact same manner that Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back, and he was unarmed and fleeing police. So you see this cycle of history repeating, and it's very disturbing. I don't have any theories about what might be different this time. However, I do see a lot more white Wisconsinites speaking up and joining protests, not just in Milwaukee, but after the Blake shooting, you saw Black Lives Matter protests in all white towns in Wisconsin, in Whitewater and in other small towns. You know, even if it was just a 50-person protest or a 100-person protest, that's still, you know, a large chunk of the population. So in terms of what has changed is I think a lot of people have woken up since Donald Trump was elected. And I think a lot of people have reached their breaking point with this and are seeing this violence for what it is.
Dan, do you have anything to add on that?
I don't have much to add except that I was surprised also, as Emma said, that there was a lot of protests. Like when I was reporting my rural Wisconsin piece, there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Reedsburg, which is traditionally a Republican town, and drew like 200 people, which it's a small town. So that was interesting to me. You know, Wisconsin has a long history with abolitionism. The Republican Party was founded in Ripon, Wisconsin, as an abolitionist, and you know, there was always that tendency coupled with other tendencies, just like anywhere else. But I don't have any particular insight into Kenosha and why the backlash didn't come to fruition. I do think that there is a fatigue, again, not just with Trump, but Wisconsinites have been living under a similar type of Trumpian politics for a lot longer than the rest of the country. This kind of divide and conquer mentality, I really think there's a lot more similarities between Scott Walker and Trump that are usually acknowledged. They have different temperaments and different manners.
Absolutely.
But on a fundamental level, it's a very similar type of approach. And you saw the rejection of Walker in 2018, I think, was hugely significant nationally for the Democrats. Tony Evers is a kind of understated person, but he did run to a degree on a return to a kind of shared sort of what I'd call a pragmatic progressivism, a focus on public infrastructure. He was a state superintendent of schools, and the roads have deteriorated so badly. And I mean, the state was always a place that had good services and prided itself on its civil service and other things like this. And that had been so politicized and damaged, like the state DNR, which was once exemplary. Aldo Leopold was involved in it. You know, they scrubbed climate change from its website and other things like this. Just really,
Department of Natural Resources.
Department of Natural Resources, right. So there was a lot of really very base kind of reactionary efforts that Walker was doing. You know, he tried to strip the Wisconsin idea from the state constitution, from state law. That the Wisconsin idea is basically that the university should try to serve the citizens as a whole, and it was kind of one of the founding premises of Bob La Follette, that the universities, the gains of it, the faculty, and the research should be directed to improve the lives of the citizenry. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of things like that, and I think that became too much for people. Also, the influence of dark money on the state. I think there's a fatigue with it, and I think Trump's hyper divisive politics had already worn themselves out in Wisconsin. Remember, he didn't do that well to win Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton got about 230,000 fewer votes than Obama did. He got roughly the same number of votes that Mitt Romney did. So there was a lot of disaffection coupled with voter suppression and other things. Mm-hmm. But people did not turn out, and that cost her, that cost the state.
One of the things that is going on right now, and again, there has been a tremendous upsurge in COVID-19 cases in the state of Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. Given the fact I guess it was the April primary, took place in person in the middle of the last upsurge in cases. Emma, do you have any sense of how this might shape the last 3.5 weeks of the campaign?
Mm-hmm. Well, what made the April election so extraordinary was, one, it was in the middle of a pandemic, which is not common for anyone. And two, what Dan was talking about earlier, which is how hyper-partisan the Wisconsin Supreme Court has become over the past 10 years, and how conservatives and Republicans in the Wisconsin state legislature do just lean on the state Supreme Court in the same way that perhaps Republicans in Congress lean on the US Supreme Court as sort of an extension of their own partisan agenda. So the most egregious move that I can think of recently is after Governor Tony Evers sent out, a stay-home mandate in the midst of the pandemic. The Republicans in the state legislature basically appealed that to the Wisconsin State Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck it down. And to put it very bluntly, we will never know how many lives that cost. The fact that the Wisconsin State Supreme Court decided to strike down an order with the explicit intent of keeping Wisconsinites safe during a pandemic. And it's very disturbing to me. And as you said, Walter, this state is in the midst of a spike now. We are a hot spot in the country, despite having a Democratic governor. And it is because of gerrymandering and voter suppression, and all of that has led to this consolidation of power in the Wisconsin state legislature and in the Wisconsin State Supreme Court that has allowed Republicans to basically kneecap any efforts at protecting Wisconsinites from the pandemic.
And of course, Dan, you're not in Wisconsin doing any more reporting, partially because of that pandemic.
Yes, I was actually, I'm reporting another piece, but I was recently in Michigan, which is similar.
I guess the difference is that no one has tried to kidnap Tony Evers.
No, well, but it was interesting. I guess the preferred destination was someplace in Wisconsin. I don't.
Yeah, they had a training weekend in Wisconsin. Those members.
Yeah. And again, these kinds of militia groups, going back to the 80s, when I was growing up in Madison, the Posse Comitatus, I don't know if listeners remember that group, but they were very active in northern Wisconsin and very active in this treaty rights movement that actually Tommy Thompson, the Republican governor of a different era, who was
on a different style Republican,
right? But he also he won in part based on resentment against treaty rights, which was a very big issue. Basically, these tribes could fish several weeks before white fishermen could, because these were rights enshrined in their 19th century treaties. But yeah, the pandemic, it's very frightening. I still have a lot of family and friends in Wisconsin, and I'm alarmed. Although I think you're seeing some spikes returning almost everywhere, including in New York. But Tony Evers, from even before he was inaugurated, there was a lame duck session that stripped him of significant powers, as well as the Attorney General. So again, it's this, minority rule. In that election, the Democrats did quite a bit better in state assembly races, but they basically wound up with the same number of seats. They're impervious. In my book, there's a guy named Fred Kessler, who was a Democratic assemblyman, and he was also a redistricting expert. And he spoke on the floor. He said, with these maps, we'll never get more than 39 seats. And in these emails released afterwards, through discovery, when the case was being brought to the federal courts, one of the mapping experts said to another, Kessler's wrong, they'll never get more than 40.
Right now, I should point out the Democrats, even after the 2018 sweep, have 36 seats in the state.
Right, and so they have it down to a science. They went for the most extreme version of the map, and it was challenged in federal court. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. It was the Whitford case, and the court ruled against the plaintiffs. But it was a very, very, very extreme partisan gerrymandering. And that has entrenched Republican power in the state since 2011.
Which is one of the reasons why Tony Evers getting elected in 2018 is so important, and it is equally important for the Democrats to hold on to enough seats to have a veto-proof majority, because this will be 2020 will be the last election conducted under the 2010 census and the gerrymandering that came out of it in Wisconsin.
That's right.
We're about to get to questions, and if anyone has a question, I urge you. This is to coin a phrase: speak now or forever hold your peace, or at least type now and forever hold your peace. But let me end, and I'm moderately upbeat about Biden winning a decisive victory on election night. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask both of you, starting with Emma, what is your worst case for election night in Wisconsin?
Oh, goodness. Worst case is just a repeat of 2016. Actually, I revised that. The worst case in my mind is that Biden wins Wisconsin, and then the Republicans in the state legislature and the Supreme Court, conservatives on the state Supreme Court, act unilaterally to nullify the right to vote of people of color in Wisconsin, which may sound out there, but I do not think is remotely out of the realm of possibility at this point.
Dan?
Well, I don't like to, get too heavily weighted towards, exact partisan outcomes, but I think that to amplify what Emma said, yes, some kind of democratic lowercase d principles are trampled upon, like people's votes aren't counted. And, I think that's the saddest thing for those of us that remember the state's previous incarnation. To a large degree, voting was encouraged by both parties. It actually had been one of the easiest states in the country to register to vote prior to 2010. And those kinds of democratic lowercase d principles are what I think helped fuel the Act 10 protests. This was a more citizen-driven place than almost anywhere else in the United States. The Capitol itself was designed to be open to the people. And La Follette and those early progressives really put those principles embedded them into the state's kind of political DNA. So much so that you had a Republican governor in the late 60s extend collective bargaining rights to state workers. But that, again, with the shift, the state's politics got really nationalized with Walker, and that has come at a great cost to the citizens and their ability to participate in a meaningful way.
We have luckily reached that magic moment. It is called, I wish I had a musical tone here, question time. Let me start off with the first one, and that question is, one of our questioners asked you, quotes, Dan, that you quoting in your book, Dan Schultz, saying, when the people find out they've been badly duped by Trump, I predict they will be spectacularly angry. Have they found out?
Well,
are they spectacularly angry?
I mean,
in terms of the Trump voters.
I think a good portion, if you look at the polls right now, it certainly seems to indicate that a lot of them are. It's also the question of, have they found out they've been spectacularly duped? That part, I'm not sure that the Democrats have done a good enough job doing. For example, Trump's promises in the Rust Belt were essential to his victory there. He promised to restore manufacturing all across, in Youngstown where I was, he said, don't sell your house. Well, the GM plant went out there. But I don't know if that aspect of his record is quite widely known enough and attacked enough by the opposition party. So I guess it's a complicated answer to the question. I don't know. I do think that it seems like Biden is a much stronger position than Hillary Clinton was in 2016. And I think there is a widespread rejection of Trumpian politics right now. At the same time, I'm not sure that they know that they've been duped. And it's also, I need to say too, that a lot of this anger, the Democratic Party was part of it too. I mean, you have a tremendous hollowing out. There's been support for big ag and these free trade deals that have done a disproportionate amount of damage in states like Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio, and there's tremendous anger there. And I do think that was part of Trump's appeal, a portion of it. And I'm not sure that Joe Biden represents enough of a difference in that direction. That said, I do think that there's fairly widespread rejection of Trump at this point. Although Wisconsin seems to be closer than most states, as you mentioned.
Emma, do you have anything to add, even though it was not your book that was quoted?
In terms of anti-Trump anger,
and people feeling duped.
Sure. Well, I think that's again where the political messaging piece of the puzzle comes in. For a lot of people who may have voted for Trump in 2016, their lives haven't gotten better over the past 4 years. Like in many states, there's a big problem with substance abuse here and alcohol abuse in Wisconsin especially. People are struggling, and it's a pandemic. People are unemployed. People in Wisconsin are just like people everywhere else in the country, and they deserve the same support systems that were championed in Milwaukee and across the state. In the first half of the 20th century, we pioneered public education, and the first kindergarten in the country was in Milwaukee. We had the string of socialist mayors, as Dan mentioned, who really championed things like public sanitation, public vaccination efforts, public health, public parks and libraries, just things that benefit the public good. And that's why it's so frustrating to me to hear conservative pundits holding forth about socialism. I actually have, just a quick anecdote, I have an uncle who lives in Kenosha who is a vehement Trump supporter. I don't talk to him very often, you'll be shocked to hear. And he denounces socialism while collecting a pension from the county that he worked for, which...
You mean this is like, don't let the government take my Medicare away?
Yes, yes. So he worked for the Public Works Department for years and years, and is now retired and has a good pension because of that, which is great. I'm all in favor of that. But it's the classic case of socialism for me, not for thee. And I think that for some people who may have voted for Trump in 2016, they aren't necessarily getting exposed to different messaging if they're just watching Fox News 12 hours a day or just listening to Mark Belling's radio show every day. That said, there are people who have broken through, either their family members have gotten through to them, or the Democratic Party's messaging. Dan mentioned Ben Wickler, who's the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, who I spoke with for my story. And he is a fantastic organizer. And I think Dan was spot on when he said that they have made up ground, that they had a very top-down campaign, the Clinton campaign did in Wisconsin in 2016, and they seem to have learned some lessons and are working on a more grassroots approach this time around. So that is my long way of saying, yes, I think some people are angry at Donald Trump in Wisconsin.
One thing I forgot to ask you, Emma, as our emblematic person sitting in Milwaukee right now, what does the campaign look like on television?
Oh my gosh.
I mean, because it is very hard for me to get a real sample of the advertising barrage sitting in the middle of Manhattan.
Sure. Shockingly, I was getting bombarded with Trump ads over the summer.
But they now seem to be broke.
And they have really evaporated in the past few weeks, I will say. I'm not a representative sample. I'm like a stereotypical millennial. I don't have real TV. I just use the internet to stream things. However, the political ads I do see have been almost 100% for Joe Biden in the past.
What themes are the Biden ads you've seen pushing?
Sorry?
What themes are the Biden ads that you've seen stressing?
I mean, it's like the campaign ads write themselves. 211,000 Americans are dead unnecessarily. And so the ads I've seen have focused on the abject failure of the Trump administration to deal with this pandemic. And as it should be, that should be the message that they are hammering for the next 3 weeks.
Let me come to another question. Are either of you seeing a chance of a senior or suburban rebuttal of Trump? Do you think it would mean anything for the aggressive conservative platform in Wisconsin? Or is it simply the residents in Wisconsin care more about demeanor and Midwestern niceness and policies at times? Although I must say the history of the voting wars of the last 10 years undermines Wisconsin nice.
Dan, do you want to take this one?
So the question about whether...
No, I mean, the questioner, I think, is there a backlash against the Republican Party going so conservative? And is there also an older voter backlash against Trump? And as far as the older voters are concerned, this is a demographic I've read a lot about. Of course, I know nothing about personally.
I think so. I mean, I think it's also like what Emma was saying. I think the pandemic is such a huge influence on everything that's happening, including probably why there wasn't more of a backlash around the Kenosha. I think the economy is quite bad in rural areas in particular. That was really what won Trump the election, was a massive outpouring of rural voters in 2016 in Wisconsin. I mean, people that were kind of like non-voters. I'm not sure, or had not historically had voted before. I'm not sure you're seeing that replay itself. But I also think that, the economy is bad. It's not going to get better until COVID is dealt with seriously. And there's probably, although Emma might know this better, a backlash against the legislature's total intransigence about doing anything for public health. I mean, any measure that Evers takes is being challenged by Robin Vos, who is a really interesting figure. Yes. And arguably has had more impact on the state than even Walker. He and Scott Fitzgerald, the two.
Explain who they are.
So I think their hold on power and their willingness to just challenge any measure, I think there's probably a fatigue with that, especially given the surge in COVID cases.
Well, Walter, to answer your question, so Robin Vos is the Wisconsin State Assembly leader, and Scott Fitzgerald is the state Senate leader, and they're both Republicans. And actually, this is perfect because I wanted to bring out this anecdote. Earlier on in April, during the Wisconsin election, while Wisconsin Republicans were, saying that the pandemic was a hoax or it wasn't as bad as it was being painted as, there was this picture of Robin Vos on election day wearing like full, almost surgical scrubs and a full like face shield and rubber gloves and everything. Meanwhile, he's trying to say that COVID-19 isn't an issue. And in the 2018 election, I think after the midterms, Vos had this quote that I think I have in my piece for the New Republic, where he basically says, like, under the current system we have, Milwaukee and Madison, the two liberal urban centers in the state, under the current system we have, they're allowed to vote. And if they didn't vote, then basically Republicans would have swept in 2018. And so the message behind that is basically like, how much more explicit can you get? You don't think people who live in cities should be allowed to vote, or you don't think that they somehow have the right to vote, or that their votes somehow don't count as much as people who live outside of urban areas. And that really struck me. I highly recommend everyone Google Robin Vos, because he's like number one on list of people I'm both fascinated and really disgusted by.
One of the things you said, the Robin Vos quote about Milwaukee and Madison, one of our questionnaires asked, where is the third largest concentration of Democrats in Wisconsin outside of Milwaukee and Madison?
That's a good question. I don't know. My hunch would be to say like Green Bay.
I think it's La Crosse, actually, which is a western city, and like that area, that's part of the Driftless area. It's one of the largest cities, and Eau Claire is also fairly liberal. That part of western Wisconsin is really fascinating because it remained Democratic when most of rural America had already trended Republican, and especially southwestern Wisconsin, it was reliably Democratic for a long time. It did begin to switch after Walker, but you saw, I mean, Obama won Wisconsin in 2008 by 14 points, and he won every county in the Driftless area, 22 counties. And I think there was a lot of hunger. Again, I think it's like it's complicated because Obama also ran that year against Big Ag. I mean, part of the reason he won the election is because he went around to rural Iowa and said that he's going to enforce these antitrust legislation, that it was hurting small farmers. And then there was disaffection. In 2012, his margin was smaller, but it was still significant. But I think it's in western Wisconsin, probably. Although it was interesting, in the state Supreme Court election, Jill Karofsky did surprisingly well in the Fox River Valley, which is traditionally Republican. That's where Joe McCarthy was from, Green Bay, Appleton. But she showed surprising strength. Even though it's a nonpartisan race, she was obviously the liberal candidate, and she won about 55% of the vote, which really shocked a lot of people. And I think it was partly a backlash against even holding the election. People were really angry that this was being done so unsafely. And you saw, pictures in Milwaukee. Emma, I'm sure, was there. Lines. People should not have been out, but there were only 5 polling places open out of about 160 or 180. So it was a travesty, and I think there was a lot of anger. But I think that anger also was 10 years in the making. There's a frustrated participation. People feel like their voice is being crushed. And I think that's part of it,
Let me end by asking a question of my own, which is about one of my favorite Republican senators, Ron Johnson, who will be on the ballot in 2022, who right now has tested positive for COVID, has announced that if he has to go to the Senate to vote for Amy Coney Barrett, he will come in a hazmat, a moon suit, as he put it. And his sense of public health is so intense that after he had his test, because he had been exposed to a Senate colleague, Mike Lee, who had COVID, in violation of all CDC rules, he immediately went to a Republican Oktoberfest near Oshkosh to give a speech, and on his way home from infecting his fellow Republicans, he learned that he had a positive test. What are the prognosis for Ron Johnson's reelection, particularly since Reince Priebus, the supposed genius of the Wisconsin Republican Party, basically got Ron Johnson elected, I guess, in 2010.
Yeah, so Johnson was elected in 2010 with that Tea Party wave in the same election where Walker was elected. And he beat out Senator Russ Feingold, who was this really well-respected progressive lion in Wisconsin, and still is well-respected. I got to talk to him for my story. And I think there are people who would want Feingold to run in 2022. I don't think Feingold himself wants to run for political office again. However, the Wisconsin Democrats, I'm sure they're thinking about who to run against him, against Johnson, that is, already.
According to my screen, there's been, I think, a time difference problem. Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes has joined us. And while we don't want to keep anyone prisoner for longer than we expected, I would love to have him answer a question or two before we call it quits. While I'm hoping to get audio from the Lieutenant Governor, I will mention that we will do another panel like this on a different state, another swing state, Pennsylvania, on October 23rd from 12 to 1 for those people who like to plan their lives 2 weeks in advance. In our limited time left, I had already introduced you a bit earlier. What I would love to ask are two quick questions. Number one, what are you seeing on the ground in Wisconsin that might be different from the polls or the news clips?
Not too much is different from the polls or the news clips, but certainly different than 2016. There's more of a coordinated effort. More people are in line right now, working in tandem versus 4 years ago. And the difference, I would say, is I just don't know that there's a real difference between the polls. I do think that we are up. However, people aren't taking it for granted, and that's a big difference from 4 years ago.
Let me ask, since I know you've been out front in terms of helping direct the state's response to the spike in COVID-19 cases, what are your concerns of how that might affect the election in Wisconsin?
Well, that's the thing. The effects may be felt with Republican legislators, especially given their inaction. They haven't met in 106 days. They haven't passed a bill, and they've been more involved in lawsuits than they have been in legislating.
But do you have turnout worries because of that and absentee worries?
I don't. The number of ballots that have already been cast, the number of absentee ballots that have already been requested, that number is encouraging, and people are aware because there are so many folks out there who are doing the voter education work, making sure people know their options to vote safely, and people are taking advantage of those options. And I think as many things that get in the news about attacks on voting, whether it's lawsuits, whether it's the uncertainty about, you know, when people will have a chance to turn in ballots, I think that it has increased the intensity in which organizations are communicating to voters about what they can and should be doing if they want to vote safely, if they want to participate in this election. And I think many times over, you'll see the more you see attacks on voting, the more intense people get about voting.
Two more quick questions as we wind down here, and I so appreciate you joining us, Lieutenant Governor. When the protest started over Kenosha, there was certainly an awful lot of Democrats outside of Wisconsin said, "Oh my God, Trump is going to use these protests to arouse the white suburban wild counties. We're going to lose Wisconsin. Oh my God, the law and order issue is just going to bring down the Democrats. Isn't it awful the way they play the racist card?" But judging from the polls, and I started out by saying the Nate Silver forecast right now gives Biden an 84% chance of winning Wisconsin. That doesn't appear to have happened. It's sort of an upbeat story. Do you have any theories as to why?
Yeah, the universe of Democrats, whether it's party, whether it's the faithful, or whether it's just spectators, is just perpetually panicked. Any small thing that happens, it's always how is this going to affect Democrats? And I said as much on Twitter yesterday, you know, and then like there's this attempt to overthrow the state of Michigan to incite a civil war, to kidnap a sitting governor. It's like
I bring him to Wisconsin.
Right. They trained in Wisconsin. They intended to bring her here, but like the question is, it never comes up is like, how is this going to affect Republicans in the election?
Mm.
Lastly, what do you worry about the most in the next 3.5 weeks?
A desperate Donald Trump.
You mean like I'm nuking Denmark because they won't sell them Greenland?
Who knows what, right? Like a desperate Donald Trump is my biggest concern.
Anyway, I wish we had more time, but I so thank you for joining us. I really thank Dan. I really thank Emma. And we really, for those who want, we're doing this again with Pennsylvania on October 23rd. And for the paid political announcement, please read the New Republic, where in addition to Dan often appears and Emma in the current issue, I have also been known to write for. Again, thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, Dan Kaufman, and Emma Roller, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.